Each of the waterfronts I've talked about in this series has a different history, a different developmental arc. Chilmark's waterfront was made out of necessity, the attempt of Chilmarkers to find a way to wrest a living from the sea when nature had only seen fit to give them exposed ocean beaches and a protected but shallow pond connected to the ocean by a meandering, ever-changing creek. Edgartown was a product of luck in that that's where Mayhew, or perhaps Pease, for you Pease tradition fans in the audience, first came ashore. Luck in its proximity to Nantucket and its ability to take over support for the Nantucket whaling fleet when the Nantucket Harbor Bar made it impossible for a laden ocean-going ship to pass. Oak Bluffs was the product of a vision of real estate speculators who looked at an empty stretch of land along the north shore of the Vineyard and imagined a secular resort, a seaside playground for the well-to-do from the cities and towns of the mainland. And then there's Vineyard Haven. Vineyard Haven was a product of opportunity. Vineyard Haven is the result of generation upon generation of islanders taking advantage of this harbor's unique geographic situation. Every vineyard waterfront is shaped by geography to some degree, but Vineyard Haven perhaps most of all. Ironically, although it's perhaps the most strongly shaped by geography, that shaping is the least obvious in Vineyard Haven than of any other vineyard waterfront. Because 3 of the 4 factors that did shape the growth of the Vineyard Haven waterfront have long since passed into history. But let's start with the one that hasn't. Vineyard Haven is the point at which the island is closest to the mainland. 5 miles from the head of the harbor to Woods Hole, maybe 3 miles as the crow flies from the tip of West Chop. If you're going to run a ferry from the mainland to the Vineyard, Vineyard Haven, not just because it's close, but also because it's beautifully sheltered in anything but a northeast gale, more about that later, is the logical place to come in. And so it was that Isaac Chase, Quaker immigrant from New Hampton, who came to the Vineyard in the late 1600s, tried to settle in Edgartown, got run off by the Mayhews, and banished to the unspeakable boondocks alongside what was then known as Holmes Hole Harbor. So it was that Isaac Chase built his house where the head of the Stop and Shop parking lot is now. If you've ever stood in front of the public restrooms, you were standing on Isaac Chase's former front lawn. It was a more attractive neighborhood when he built the house there in the late 1690s. Isaac Chase, among his other pursuits, ran a ferry service which passed to his son, Abraham. That was inevitable. The name, I mean, not the handing on of the business. And the ferry boat came across from Falmouth, a little sail-driven thing, no doubt, a sloop or a cutter or whatnot. And it sailed up the harbor and in where the Steamship Authority is now, and up Water Street, through the 5 corners, up Lagoon Pond. Well, okay. No, it didn't sail up Lagoon Pond Road because there was no Lagoon Pond Road in the late 1600s. In the late 1600s, the waterway that connected Lagoon Pond to Vineyard Haven Harbor proper was a tidal channel known as Bass Creek, which came out roughly where the dinghy beach by the bus circle at the Steamship Authority is, ran across the truck parking area, down between the Steamship Authority ticket office and the Stop and Shop parking lot, through the 5 corners, and on up what's now Lagoon Pond Road into the lagoon. If you wanted to get into the lagoon prior to 1815, you sailed up to the head of the harbor and up Bass Creek, which at 6 or 7 feet was deep enough to take a small brig or a small schooner or the kind of sloop or cutter that Chase ran for his ferry service. So from the get-go, Vineyard Haven was the place where regularly scheduled service from the mainland touched the island. It's true that the Chamber of Commerce calls Vineyard Haven the island's principal ferry port. And I've always suspected, as a lifelong Vineyard Havenite, summer first, now permanent, that they only call it that because it's the only darn thing they can think to say about it, but there you go. It's been the vineyard's principal ferry port literally almost as long as there's been a vineyard. Back to that at the end of the talk too, but more about Bass Creek for a minute. Bass Creek is significant both because it's kind of jarring to imagine Lagoon Pond Road and Water Street being a literal waterway capable of taking a sizable vessel, but also because its availability shaped the early commercial structure of Vineyard Haven. Because Lagoon Pond was more sheltered than the harbor proper, because you could ride out even a northeast gale in Lagoon Pond. Nor'easter comes plowing up the coast in September or October. Where does the shipyard put a whole load of smaller boats? Through the bridge up in Lagoon Pond. Because of that, what we think of as the natural position of Vineyard Haven Village, right there, boom, around the head of the harbor where the Steamship Authority is an artifact of that long vanished creek that ran where Lagoon Pond Road and the Five Corners are now. Had Bass Creek not been there, it's entirely possible that Vineyard Haven would have grown up, or an alternate village with a different name would have grown up someplace else on the harbor. We've covered two of the geographic realities: proximity to the mainland, the existence of Bass Creek, which led from the relatively sheltered main harbor into the incredibly sheltered pond. Here's the third reality for all you municipal politics buffs out there, both of you. Imagine the vineyard prior to, say, 1850. Three towns: Edgartown, the eastern third of the island; Tisbury, the central third of the island; Chilmark, the western third of the island; Gay Head, Oak Bluffs, Aquina, for Gay Head, Oak Bluffs, West Tisbury don't yet exist. They haven't yet been carved out of their parent towns. Crank it back another 100 years, Tisbury is still the center of the island, stretching from the center of Vineyard Haven Harbor all the way to the current Chilmark border at Nabbs Corner and Teasquam River. But its center, its throbbing, bustling, okay, maybe I exaggerate, but its center, its commercial heart, is present-day West Tisbury Village. From the beginnings of European settlement on the island down well into the late 1700s, Holmes Hole, as it was called then, this village we're now sitting in, was a backwater, an outlying outpost of Tisbury. The real action, the real happening place in the town of Tisbury, all 1,003 population, was over there in what's now West Tisbury. Meanwhile, across the harbor, Eastville. If you think Eastville is the comparative boondocks relative to present-day Oak Bluffs, imagine what it was like when there was no Oak Bluffs, when Oak Bluffs consisted of a half dozen farms around the northern end of Senjak and Tackett, and a scattering of houses north of the end of Lagoon Pond. When Eastville, the village on the eastern side of Holmes Hole Harbor, was a distant outpost of Edgartown Center. So if you imagine the world like that, Vineyard Haven Harbor is sandwiched between two minor outlying villages. But they weren't the only villages around the edges of the harbor. There was Holmes Hole proper, of which this schoolhouse, as it once was, marked more or less the northern border. There was Eastville across the way, roughly where the hospital is now. And then there was Down the Neck. Down the Neck, for those of you who live in Vineyard Haven, this is all about to make a sudden crystalline amount of sense. For those of you who don't, prepare to be lost for about 2 sentences, but I promise I'll get back to your reality in a second. Down the Neck is approximately equivalent to everything from Owen Little Way to Grove Avenue today. Down the Neck was, back in the day, a distinct village with its own school, its own population, its own wharf at the foot of Grove Avenue where a ship chandlery was erected. And there was a time in the early 19th century when Down the Neck was rivaling Holmes Hole up at the head of the harbor as the principal eastern population center of the town of Tisbury. In the fullness of time, Westchop, the far tip of Westchop, developed as a summer colony with its own steamer wharf, its own post office, its own cluster of people who thought of that as their little corner of Tisbury. And onward it goes. My point here is that Vineyard Haven, Holmes Hole, was one of a cluster of villages, a cluster of small population centers strung like beads in a necklace around the outer edge of Vineyard Haven Harbor. That it ultimately became the principal population center, the principal commercial center of the northern part of the island, eclipsing Eastville, absorbing Down the Neck into a wholly owned bedroom suburb, was not in the beginning a foregone conclusion. And now we come to the fourth geographic reality. We've had proximity, we've had the easy access to the lagoon, we've had the fact that Vineyard Haven Harbor was sandwiched between two distant population centers. Okay, distant by Vineyard terms. And here's the fourth one, the one that matters most of all, and the one that in some ways is the hardest to envision today. You've all heard the statistic probably, but it bears repeating. Once upon a time, Vineyard Sound was the second busiest waterway on Earth, second only to the English Channel. Depending on whose numbers you use, 30, 40, 50, 80,000, 5 figures, vessels a year pass through Vineyard Sound. Back in the 80s when the airlines deregulated and the hub and spoke route map was a new thing that people were just coming to terms with, this actually is going somewhere. There was a joke that went around, when you die, it doesn't matter if you're going to heaven or going to hell, you have to go through Atlanta. Up until 1914, if you were going anywhere north of Havana or south of Halifax or between any pair of cities on the eastern seaboard of North America, on either side of Cape Cod, you went through Vineyard Sound. Why did you go through Vineyard Sound? Because the alternative was going south of the Vineyard, south of Nantucket, and then bending around through the great beyond west of Nantucket, where the only thing between you and Portugal is a seagull who's bobbing around on the swells wondering what he ever did to deserve this fate. So you don't, if you know what's good for you, go south of the Vineyard and south of Nantucket. You set your course between the Elizabeth Islands and the Vineyard. Moving east, you take your sight on the lighthouse at Gay Head, to which some of you are decamping as soon as I'm done to go watch Liz Witham's new film about the keepers of the Gay Head Light. If you're sailing west, you look for Cape Pogue Light to the south, Nobska Light to the northeast, and you thread your way into that narrow neck of water that is Vineyard Sound. Look at a map sometime. Look at a map big enough to show the entire southern Cape and the Vineyard and Nantucket. Vineyard Sound, the stuff that's between West Tisbury, Chilmark, Aquina, and the Elizabeth Islands, is this narrow, maybe 5.5 mile stretch of water, like the neck of a funnel. You pass Vineyard Haven Harbor and it starts to rapidly widen because the Cape jogs north at Osterville, because the Vineyard dives south at Oak Bluffs. And by the time you're even east to west with Cape Pogue, you're in this gigantic open space between Nantucket and the Cape. So a narrow neck studded with shoals, middle ground, sow and pigs, Devil's Bridge, leading into this vast space between Nantucket and the Cape, also studded with shoals, bigger shoals, worse shoals, Bishop and Clerk's, Handkerchief, Pollock Rip, Monomoy, all that. Now imagine you're J. Random Captain from Savannah, from St. Augustine, from Halifax, from Castine. This isn't your backyard. You don't know these waters like the back of your hand. And you know perfectly well that if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you're going to be the headline in next week's Gazette in a story in which the lead involves words like tragedy and dead bodies. Therefore, Vineyard Haven. Vineyard Haven was the place where local men sailed out in their small sloops and hailed passing ships as they came upon Cape Pogue or came upon Gay Head or even further east, and said, "Would you like a pilot? Would you like me to come aboard and, for a small fee of course, guide you with my encyclopedic local knowledge of tides and currents and rips and shoals through these treacherous waters? You can just drop me off over there in Chatham. I'll make my own way back." Vineyard Haven was the place, because enormous Deepwater Harbor, where if you had a foul wind or a foul tide, or it was dark, or you'd been 3 days bashing your way against a northerly gale on your way up the coast, and you just wanted to not have 20-foot waves breaking over your forecastle for the next couple of watches, Vineyard Haven was where you stopped for the night, for the weekend, for whatever short span of time you needed to catch your breath or wait for the weather to change. If Vineyard Sound was the I-75 of the age of sail, Vineyard Haven was, and I mean this in total seriousness, a 24-hour all-night truck stop. Oak Bluffs existed for the tourists. Chilmark, Menemsha, Squidnocket, Lobsterville was for the dayboat fishermen. Edgartown was for the whaling fleet and the inbound ships from abroad that called at the customs office to give Uncle Sam his piece of the pie and to feed the god of paperwork his necessary offerings. Vineyard Haven existed for the transient coastal trade, for the schooners and brigs that were the 18-wheelers of the 17 and 1800s. It was where 20, 30, 40 schooners at a time would be seen riding at anchor, out there in the harbor, and where smaller vessels would congregate up at the head of the lagoon, having sailed in through Bass Creek. And the town itself grew to reflect that role. Out on Hatch Road, just up the street from my house, a Unitarian minister named Daniel Waldo Stevens came in the middle of the 19th century and built what he called the Sailors' Free Reading Room. It was a mission, in essence. There was a chapel, but it was also a place for sailors to come ashore, to relax, to read the newspapers, to have a non-alcoholic beverage. For the other kind, there was Eastville. Eastville, Fritz Knight assures me, and why should I disagree with such an august authority? Eastville was the Barbary coast of the 19th century Vineyard, a land of gin shops and brothels and places where people played the piano late at night and sang the kind of songs that you wouldn't want to share with grandma when you got back home to wherever you'd come from. But at the Sailors' Free Reading Room on Hatch Road, Reverend Stevens welcomed sailors for more sedate forms of entertainment and ran a pipe from the spring that bubbled up on the hill down to the dock so that sailors could bring their water casks from their ships and fill them for free right there at the dock without having to lift the empty cask, or more to the point, the full one, into and out of the boat. It became a gathering place, as did the chandlery at the foot of Grove Avenue, where in the 1870s, George Washington Eldridge, father of the famous cartographer from Chatham, started hawking his father's Everything You Needed to Know About Vineyard and Nantucket Sound But Were Afraid to Ask booklets, which in the fullness of time and under the direction of George Eldridge's daughter and son-in-law, Ruth Eldridge White, and her husband, whose name has fled like a scalded cat and will not return until 2 seconds after I'm done, became the familiar goldenrod colored Eldridge's Tide and Pilot book, which is still available for sale at a bookstore near you and on the bookshelf of, I suspect, many of the people in this room. The chandlery, like all chandleries, sold not just charts and Tide and Pilot books, but also anything you might need on board a ship: rope, canvas, sailmaker's tools, compasses, whatnot. And there were blacksmith shops and sail repair shops and whatever else a passing ship might need up at the head of the harbor there. In time, Reverend Stevens went the way of all flesh, and a new chapel and place of respite for sailors opened up at the foot of Union Wharf, where the Steamship Authority Wharf is now. It was called the Seamen's Bethel, and it was founded by the Boston Seamen's Friends Society, which was busy franchising, in effect. Got a truck stop, you gotta have a franchise. Franchising, in effect, what Reverend Stevens had done out there on Hatch Road. Provide a place where sailors could meet, congregate, rest, hear a little of the gospel, talk to each other, take a load off, and sit on something that wasn't bobbing up and down and rocking back and forth simultaneously. The Vineyard Haven Seamen's Bethel, the history of which is chronicled in that tan-covered Intelligencer that we're giving away for free on the registration table, was founded by a man named Madison Edwards, whose defining characteristic was that he looked like the little fellow on the Monopoly money. Not, of course, that anybody thought that at the time, because Monopoly was still about 40 years from being invented. Yet, nonetheless, you look at a picture of Madison Edwards and it's difficult not to say, put that man in free parking. Madison Edwards was not just your basic stay-at-home preacher, however. He had a motor-driven launch called the Helen May, in which every evening he went out and made the rounds of the schooners in the harbor and asked if anybody might want to come ashore for some singing and little religious service and whatnot. And as he made the rounds, he not only collected people to bring them to the Bethel, he listened to tales of people's troubles. Pastor, I've got a toothache, or the agent in the last port down the line owed me money and wouldn't pay me, or I need to write a letter home, but my handwriting isn't so good and I've never really finished the 3rd grade. Can you help me? And Madison Edwards did help them. He pulled teeth, he fixed minor injuries, and he shepherded the people with more major injuries to the Marine Hospital, which in those days had just been founded on the front edge of the bluff overlooking the lagoon. He helped mediate wage disputes, he wrote letters, and when sailors died in port or died in transit, and Vineyard Haven was the next port that they came to, he arranged for their burial in the sailors' cemetery that's off the Edgartown Vineyard Haven Road, more often than not digging the grave himself. He acquired an assistant in the form of a tall, broad-shouldered young man named Austin Tower, who succeeded in the business by the age-old expedient of marrying the boss's daughter, and whose other great contribution to vineyard history, other than running the Seaman's Bethel, first as Edwards' assistant and then as his successor, was to strike up a friendship on a mission trip to Jamaica with a young pastor named Oscar Denniston, who came north with his family and founded the Bradley Memorial Church in Oak Bluffs just after the turn of the century. Austin Tower is one of those people who, if they haven't made a movie about him, I'm sure I can't understand why. He was tall, broad-shouldered, handsome, and vigorous. He did everything that his boss and father-in-law did, but he was also more than capable. When it was decided that there should be a Bethel-owned plot in Oak Grove Cemetery in which to inter sailors who died in the Bethel's care, and that cemetery plot should have a monument in the form of a lighthouse, Austin Tower was the guy who took the Bethel launch. It was named the Madison Edwards by that point, the original one having worn out from years of hard use. It was Madison Edwards who time after time after time, Austin Tower who took the Madison Edwards, the launch, across to Nashawn and gathered cobbles the size of a cantaloupe, the size of a soccer ball from the beach, lugged them to the boat, carried them back to Vineyard Haven, and carted them up to Oak Grove Cemetery, where they were cemented into the lighthouse you see standing over the Bethel plot today. In his journals, there's a notation about helped a boy from a schooner resolve a wage dispute. And I have no doubt that Austin Tower was a kind and gentle and soft-spoken man of God through and through. But I also suspect that if the person who owed that boy wages found the 6'2" boulder schlepping Austin Tower standing in his doorway asking if something might not be done on behalf of this lad and the money he was owed, one suspects that it would take a pretty hard-hearted ship owner to not realize the error of his ways and think that, yes, the money might indeed be found. Oh, right in this drawer here. Austin Tower was not a force to be trifled with. Nor, I hasten to add, since I live with the results of it every day, was Dr. Charles Banks, who was one of the early chief surgeons, not at the original Marine Hospital on the front edge of the bluff, repurposed from an old lighthouse building that they built and equipped with a Fresnel lens before realizing that a lighthouse at the head of Holmes Hole Harbor was an answer to a question that nobody had asked. But no, Banks was the chief surgeon. Banks was the chief surgeon at the second Marine Hospital, the 1895 Marine Hospital, the fine new state-of-the-art building that was built back from the edge of the cliff to give the passing ships and sailors that paused in Vineyard Haven the best available medical care. Perhaps you've heard of the building. Charles Banks's job was doctoring to passing sailors. His hobby was local history and genealogy. While Madison Edwards was hauling rocks back from Nashawn, Banks was interviewing everybody he could find who'd worked on the history of the vineyard, poring over town records, letters, diaries, documents, and compiling his epic 3-volume history of the vineyard, which he also illustrated. And the illustrations, except for the inexplicable presence of somebody who looks like General Custer in the one of the Marine Hospital, are beautiful examples of pen and ink artwork. The picture of Vineyard Haven Harbor gracing the front of the green-covered Intelligencer is, if memory serves, one of his. The Marine Hospital opened in 1895, and it must have seemed like an ideal investment, an investment in making Vineyard Haven the kind of welcoming place for passing ships that it had always been destined to be. Well, the world works in funny ways, because Vineyard Haven, in the form that it existed for centuries going back, all the way back to Isaac Chase really, had about 20 years left to live. In 1914, the Army Corps of Engineers cut the Cape Cod Canal through what one author more poetic than I'd be inclined to be in a title called The Bare and Bended Arm of Massachusetts. The Cape Cod Canal, once it was finished, made it possible to sail north of the Elizabeth Islands up through Buzzards Bay and out at Plymouth, sidestepping Vineyard Sound, Nantucket Sound, and the outer edge of Cape Cod. Around the same time, 1914, the old sail-driven schooner trade was dying. The pictures of Vineyard Haven Harbor in those days, 1910, 1912, 1913, show Vineyard Haven Harbor crowded not so much with schooners, although there were still schooners there, but with tugs anchored at Union Wharf. The presence of the tugs there implying strings of barges riding at anchor out in the harbor proper. Because tugs and barges and motor-driven freighters like the Port Hunter that sank out on Hedge Fence Shoal in the last days of World War I don't need to wait for a fair tide or a fair wind, because they can just keep going in anything short of a gale. There was less need for a marine hospital, less need for a Bethel, less need for an entire constellation of marine-focused businesses arrayed around the head of the harbor. Bass Creek, too, had long since been closed, and a drawbridge built over the entrance that the hurricane of 1815 had blasted through the barrier beach between the lagoon and the harbor. As a result, the lagoon had functionally ceased to be a place of refuge for ships, certainly for ships anything bigger than Isaac Chase's old shallow draft cutter. And consequently, by the end of the 19th century, that bit I alluded to earlier about Vineyard Haven is protected from anything but a northeast storm started to become increasingly relevant. That particular bill came due in force in November of 1898. A northeast gale roared in from the Atlantic, as northeast gales do even today. And when people woke up the next morning, there were 20 or 30 schooners driven up on the beach. One of them had cut Union Wharf nearly in two, the bowsprit coming within a few feet of impaling Madison Edwards' office. In good practical Vineyard Haven fashion, they couldn't figure out how to float the schooner off in anything like short order, so they just threw up their hands and built a sort of catwalk around the bow that allowed you to get from the inboard to the outboard end of the dock without climbing over the ship. There is a wonderful postcard from about 1900 in which the wharf has been rebuilt, the schooner is gone, but there's still this inexplicable catwalk that angles out parallel to the dock and then back again, that unless you know, oh yes, that was where the bow of the schooner was, makes no sense at all. So between its increasing vulnerability to storms with no place to take your ship and its increasing insignificance in the world of sailors and the coasting trade, Vineyard Haven lost its principal economic reason for existence right around the end of World War I. There were still schooners here and there. Zeb Tilton still brought his Alice Wentworth up to the beach to load and unload cargo. My father, a boy then, remembers him taking a barrel full of God knows what and deadlifting it over his head and putting it on the deck. Whatever else was true of Zeb Tilton, he was a formidable person. Presumably he was who Austin Tower called when the ship owners got obstreperous about back wages. Joke. But Zeb was the last of the coastal schooner captains. The chandlery had long since closed down and the Bethel catered to fewer and fewer people each year. The Marine Hospital was still there, but more and more of its patients were Coast Guardsmen from Woods Hole, retired merchant sailors, Navy men from the Naval Air Station that was being bulldozed out of the state forest during World War II, and so forth. Vineyard Haven needed another reason for existence, and it found it, perhaps improbably or perhaps inevitably, in its proximity to the mainland, its deep water harbor, and its halfway to anywhere location on the coast of southern New England. It became, after World War II, like Edgartown, but in some ways even more so than Edgartown, a stopover point for summer yachtsmen, a center of small boat racing. The Vineyard Haven Yacht Club was founded there in 1928 and has been giving, local pride, Edgartown a run for their money ever since. Only one yacht club has ever won the National Junior Championships 4 years straight, and it's located about a half a mile that way. Admittedly, that was in the 1930s when competition was a little less extensive. Vineyard Haven also, improbably for the first time in 100 years, became a center of boat building. Boat building for the Navy during World War II, barges and launches and utility vessels, but boat building for yachtsmen as well. Erford Burt, a fellow from Up Island who'd been an apprentice under Mantle Swartz Roberts, the catboat king of Edgartown, went to work as foreman at what's now the Martha's Vineyard shipyard in the 30s, and there designed both the Vineyard's first built for the purpose internal combustion engine fishing boat, the famous Erford Burt bass boat, which, well, if you've ever seen Ben Gardner's boat in Jaws, you've seen one. High square stern, sharp bow, wood-framed glass windshield, designed from the ground up for an inboard engine. He designed the Vineyard Haven 15, of which 50 were built over the years, and which was the predominant racing class of the Vineyard Haven Yacht Club. He designed the Menemshias that sailed at the St. Pierre School of Sport, which is what the Marine Hospital became when the government sold it to the St. Pierre family for $1 in 1952. The shipyard went from building Vineyard 15s to locally designed Vineyard Vixens, and somewhere as the Vixen was being run up on the ways for the first time, a fellow named Nat Benjamin put into port and thought that this might be a nice place to revive the art of wooden small craft building. Partnered with a guy named Ross Gannon, whose hobby was disassembling and moving historic barns, among other things. And, well, you know the rest of that story. It seems perhaps improbable that Vineyard Haven, once one of the busiest ports on the entire East Coast, on one of the busiest waterways in the entire world, ultimately wound up being a haven for summer yachtsmen, for dilettante small boat racers, and for people building craft that mostly topped out at about 30 feet. Or in the case of the ship model shop my grandfather ran for 30 years on Beach Road, about 30 inches. And yet, in a bigger picture, it makes a certain cosmic sense. Vineyard Haven, of all the waterfront towns on the island, is the one where, no matter where you are in downtown, it's impossible to escape from the smell and the sound and the presence of the sea. Vineyard Haven is and always has been a place defined by the knowledge that 2 blocks away, you can set your feet on the edge of the water, push your boat out into the waves, and sail off to whatever the next destination is on the adventure you stopped in the middle of. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you all for coming, and if you've been here before, thank you for coming to this series. It's been a pleasure. And though I don't want to keep you over long, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take a swing at them or make up a plausible lie.
Thank you so much. I so enjoyed your Town lecture. Unfortunately, it's the only other one I went to. Loving the book. I'm in the middle
Thank
of
you.
reading through slowly. But are you going to put together something with pictures of the history of Vineyard Haven?
Well, when I finished the Edgartown book, Arcadia Press said, "So, got any other island towns in mind?" And I said, "Well, how do you feel about Vineyard Haven?" So that is definitely on the horizon if they're still liking the idea. Phil tells me that we have a museum that we should probably get moved before I think too hard about that. But yes, coming reasonably soon to a bookstore near you.
Great.
Yes?
And I also attended your Town lecture and enjoyed that immensely. Thank you. The fact that, as you said, the town center was way away from the harbor, it seems improbable to me, knowing that at the time, speed or travel was at about 3 miles an hour with an oxen or a walking horse. And it just seems odd that if they land here and, they got water, they got all the things they need, why they would have all congregated up that way.
Well, there's the answer to your question, is that they didn't land here. They landed in Edgartown and worked their way west along what's now the Edgartown West Tisbury Road, but what was for the Wampanoag a path going back untold thousands of years. And they settled in West Tisbury, from current West Tisbury Center on down to Quansu, Black Point, that area. In large part for the same reason the Wampanoag had liked the area: good farmland, running water, all the basics that you'd need to establish a farming community. Holmes Hole, today's Vineyard Haven, was almost an afterthought. It was a handy place to bring in the ferry from the mainland. It was a handy place for ships bound up and down the coast to call. And so the village grew up around that, but the settlers, in terms of spreading out across the island, saw Holmes Hole as an afterthought. It was for ages known as the East Parish of Tisbury. And because the church was in what we think of as West Tisbury, There was actually a Donnybrook of fair proportions in the colonial era about citizens of what's now Holmes Hole objecting to paying their share of the salary of a minister who, as you say, they never got to hear because you couldn't afford to schlep yourself out to West Tisbury Center at 3 miles an hour and back again of a Sunday if you wanted to attend anything else. Eventually, they got excused from paying the tithe to cover the minister's salary. Eventually, people started up churches in beautiful downtown Holmes Hole. But yeah, the remoteness was definitely a thing. When Isaac Chase was urged to maybe try over there, he was definitely being exiled. Yes?
Can you explain so it started with West Tisbury, and then it was Holmes Hole, and when was it Tisbury and when was it Vineyard Haven?
Ah, my favorite, well, okay, maybe not my favorite, but one of my favorite questions. If you imagine the township of Tisbury, the area of land that, back up for a second. For those of you not from New England, the concept of township is totally alien because in most of the rest of the world, Georgia, Illinois, whatever, there's the county. There are incorporated municipalities studying the county like raisins in raisin bread. And then there's this thing that New Englanders find mystical and confusing called unincorporated whatever county. I say this as somebody who has lived in unincorporated whatever county. I don't recommend it. In New England, there is no land outside of the boundaries of a township. Townships snuggle up against each other. The vineyard was divided, as I said, initially into 3 of them. So Tisbury encompassed all the land in the center of the island between Edgartown and Chilmark and had half a dozen villages, of which Middletown, today's West Tisbury, was the most prominent, but also Holmes Hole, Lambert's Cove, and so on and so forth, North Tisbury. What happened in 1892 was that fundamental schism between the eastern part of Tisbury, which had always looked to the sea and looked to Holmes Hole Harbor, and the western part of Tisbury, which had always looked to the land and to farming, finally reached a breaking point, and the citizens looked at each other and said, you know, this is not one town, this is 2 towns flying in close formation through a historical accident. And they said, right, let's divide this in 2 and we'll call the western agricultural half West Tisbury Township and the eastern maritime-focused half Tisbury. Now, in a more rational world, would Tisbury have remained attached to the one with the steepled church and the ag hall, and this became East Tisbury? Yeah, probably, but what's it gonna do? As a result, because the town of Tisbury and the town of West Tisbury were of unequal size, look at it on the map, Tisbury is tiny, West Tisbury is huge. They started off each with a couple of villages in them, but that was also the moment at which Down the Neck collapsed into Vineyard Haven proper. Lambert's Cove started to disband as an organized community, and Tisbury was left with a single population center, a single village, which by then had named itself Vineyard Haven because really who wants to live in a hole? Which results by the 20th century, I thank you, Kay Mayhew, for that story. Apparently the good ladies of Holmes Hole actually got together in the 1870s and petitioned the U.S. Postal Service to change the name of the post office to Vineyard Haven because they were tired of having to return address their letters Holmes Hole. It sounded undignified. So by the 20th century, Tisbury is a relatively small township with a single village of Vineyard Haven, which is the underlying reason for all those spectacularly unhelpful answers like Well, Vineyard Haven is a village in the town of Tisbury, which, like the punchline of the joke about the balloonist who floats over a building, yells down at the guy on the lawn, "Where am I?" And the guy looks up and says, "You're in a balloon," is completely accurate and utterly useless. Any other questions? Or have I scared you off? Okay, yes.
Just to clarify, now currently, is this Vineyard Haven or is this Tisbury? And
Ye-
what-
Yes.
You're in a balloon.
Okay. You are currently in the town of Tisbury, which is a geographic region bordered by Vineyard Sound, Vineyard Haven Harbor, West Tisbury, and Oak Bluffs. At this very moment, you are in the village of Vineyard Haven, which is the largest and only population center worthy of the name in the town of Tisbury. If you drove out to West Chop Light and watched the sunset, which I highly recommend, you would be in Tisbury but not in Vineyard Haven.
Where does Vineyard Haven work?
The historical boundaries of Vineyard Haven pretty much run from here down to about where the Edgartown Vineyard Haven Road is, and down to about where the Martha's Vineyard Times office is on the far side of Beach Road, because until the very late 19th century, once you got past the Times office, it was all sand all the time, except for the precursor of the shipyard, which was outstanding on the sand spit. And maybe it extends as far as the Marine Hospital. As to whether nowadays, in this day and age, Vineyard Haven has crept its way out along State Road to the Tashmoo Overlook, I leave for the Chamber of Commerce and the selectmen to make a decision on. But there are parts of Tisbury that are definitively not in Vineyard Haven. The half of Lambert's Cove Road, for example, that's not in West Tisbury, is definitively Tisbury but not Vineyard Haven. The far side of Tashmoo is Tisbury but not Vineyard Haven. Although both of them were distinct population centers as late as the late 19th century, Lambert's Cove having its own church, even its own school.
West Chop has its own post office.
And West Chop had its own summer post office, which has now been repurposed as a tennis shop. Because, Grand Vineyard tradition, never throw away a perfectly good building if you can do something else with it. Erford Burt, when he went into business for himself at the head of the lagoon in the shadow of the Marine Hospital, acquired the long since defunct North Tisbury Baptist Church, disassembled it, moved it down there, and used it as his workshop. The local wharf rats jokingly referred to it as the Bass Creek Meeting House. And when asked how he felt about working in a disestablished church, Erford, in that Erfordian way of his, just said, well, better the building, better the work, and got on with whatever boat he was building. Any other questions? Yes, David?
People behind us ask history of this building.
History of this building. Originally built by the town as a schoolhouse, used as a meeting house at one point. Subsequently, later in the 19th century, used by the Daughters of the American Revolution as a headquarters, who put the plaque on the flagpole outside, commemorating the 3 young women who blew up a similar flagpole to prevent it being appropriated by the British during the Revolution. The DAR, when they gave up the building, it was passed, I believe, to Sale Martha's Vineyard, and subsequently to the Preservation Trust, which is why if you ask an old-time citizen of Vineyard Haven, what's that building? pointing to this one, they'll say, oh, it's the DAR Sale MV Museum, Nathan Mayhew Schoolhouse Building. Why do you ask? I know this firsthand because we've had the use of it for the last 3 years and change, and we've called it the Morgan Learning Center. And I have occasionally said to people, it's at the Morgan Learning Center, and get a blank look. It's at the Sale MV building? It's at the DAR building. Oh, the DAR building, why didn't you say so? So that.
So is it belonging to the Preservation Trust or to the museum? Or?
The museum has leased it these 3 years. Stop me if I'm wrong.
It ends at the end of this year when we.
Thank you.
And
Yeah,
the
Preservation
Preservation Trust
Trust,
keeps
now the
it?
Vineyard Trust is the owner of it. Yeah.
Is the Vineyard Trust the same thing as the Preservation Trust?
Yes, they just changed it.
These vineyarders, they've got 3 names for everything. Tisbury, Vineyard Haven, Preservation Trust, Vineyard Trust.
Gainful employment, yes, they're always changing.
And I've been your speaker for the evening, Fred Smith, and no. Probably got time for one more. Anybody? Yes, please.
The Tower family, the big fellow, what became of them? Because there's the tower this in Kataman, the tower that over there. Is that all stemming from the family, and are they still?
That is an excellent question to which somebody probably knows the answer, but I am not that person. I know that Austin Tower had a daughter who grew up here. I don't know whether other members of the family are still around on island, or whether the things named Tower this or that are related.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you all very much.